Hello, my name is Corey Ziegler. I'm starting a new YouTube channel, kind of like an audiobook, so I will be uploading this to YouTube. I'm going to be reading, it's called Alone Yet Not Alone. It's based on a true story, and it's the special movie edition by Tracy, Leninger, Craven. And here is the it's backwards, but here is the cover. Introduction. Deep within America, vast frontier, nestled high among the blue mountains of Pennsylvania, was a lush green valley fringed on its southern border by Penn Creek, long before any settlers beheld its beauty or tilled the soil. The Indians named this fertile land Buffalo Valley. Despite the wild country, a handful of families became to dwell there. They lived happily in harmony with both God and man, even with the Indians. Barbara Imagina Leininger's family was among these few. They came across the sea from Germany to start a new life in America. They forged their way over the unmarked mountain ranges to the farthest outpost on the Pennsylvania frontier. With their own hands, they built a little log cabin nestled between two huge maple trees on a knoll overlooking Penn's Creek. Each day they toiled tirelessly, never regretting comforts they had left behind or the rigors of the frontier life they had chosen. Tired though they were, their hearts were alive with spirit and full of thanksgiving to God for blessing them in their new homeland. The fall of 1755 bestowed on the Leiningers world not only its rich beauty, but also a rewarding harvest. On this particular day, the whole valley seemed to rejoice in the fullness of the season. The autumn sun settled in the western sky, illuminating the rich tones of the maple trees and lightening the valley with hues of crimson and gold. Its rays reflected in the creek's rushing water until it glistened and jumped like fire. Dusk settled peacefully upon the Leininger family as they completed their day's work and prepared for the evening meal. Everything was as it had been the day before. Everything, that is, except the dark tanned figure as silent as one of the oaks crouching on the rigid ridge that overlooked the creek. His clothing blended with the surrounding forest. His penetrating dark eyes watched the family's every move. Chapter 1. End of a Perfect Day. Barbara Leininger shielded her blue eyes from the sun as she looked at the small corn stalks that stretched high above her. Though she was tall for a 12-year-old, Barbara felt far too short as she stood on her tiptoes to grab one last ear of corn. The sun began to sink low on the horizon, casting its rays on her golden hair. "There," she said to Regina, her 9-year-old sister, who stood with a half-filled apron. "Now we can head home and help Mama with dinner. And I'll even let you carry the juicy ears of corn." She placed the prized ear in her sister's homespun apron. Regina's eyes sparkled with pleasure, and a mischievous smile played around her deep pink lips. "Thank you kindly, sister," she said with a slight curtsy. Then, without a second's warning, Regina dashed through the field toward their cabin. "I'll race you back," she cried merrily, over her shoulder. Barbara, who always loved a challenge, was off in a flash. It didn't take long for her to catch up to Regina, but she held back, allowing her younger sister the pleasure of winning. They both arrived home breathless, but laughing gaily, their eyes shiny and their cheeks rosy. Their mother stood in the doorway of their little log cabin and greeting her daughters in German. "I see my girls have been hard at work today." as she picked the corn from their aprons. Her kind eyes and loving smile warmed Barbara's heart. "Run along now and see if you can help your father." Barbara took Regina's hand and led her around to the woodpile, where her father was chopping wood. With a determined blow, he split one last log. Then, burying the sharp axe in the old tree stump, he bent down to pat their German shepherd. Luther, in return, the dog, wagged his tail furiously and licked his master's hand. Barbara stoops down to gather small pieces of wood for kindling, but Regina stood with her eyes fixed on the horizon. Looking up, Barbara followed her gaze. John, their 19-year-old brother, emerged from the woods at the far end of the field. His musket was flung over his shoulder, and even from the distance, Barbara could see the wide grin on his face. When Barbara saw Christian, their oldest brother, who was 20, she knew immediately why John was grinning. 2 plump geese hung over his shoulder. Luther ran to meet them, barking loudly and jumping up to lick their faces. "Thank heaven," Mother Leninger cried. "They have returned home safely." The worry lines on her brow disappeared. "We will have meat with our dinner, too," she whispered, a prayer of thanks. The Lord had blessed another day's labor. Mother Leninger smiled and hurried back inside their cabin to the hearth to finish dinner. Soon the last glimmer of sun had faded beyond the western horizon, and the frontier family was serene in the comfort of their snug cabin. The light from the hearth cast a warm glow about them, softening each face. They shared the kind of family unity that comes from working together with one goal. Not just survival in this sometime hostile land, but the serving their heavenly master by walking in genuine love. After their hearty supper, Barbara helped her mother clear the table. Regina snuggled between her 2 big brothers, listening intently as they told of their hunting adventures. Barbara noticed Father look up from the old leather harness he was repairing with a gratified smile and look lovingly at each of his children, lingering a moment longer on Regina. Barbara knew Regina, the baby of the family, held a special place in all their hearts. Her childlike love for life, wild imagination, and animated personality both amused and endeared for her to all of them. She was her mother's namesake and could not have been named... I apologize. Better, with her name, chestnut brown hair, and eyes as true as a blue sea on a sunny day. Father always said Regina's eyes sparkled like the ocean, just like her mama's eyes. Barbara overheard bits and pieces of John's story as she scraped the leftovers into a dish for Luther, who lay at the hearth, wagging his tail and licking his jaws. "I was sneaking through a thickly wooded riverbank," said John, "when suddenly I saw 2... John," Regina shook his head frantically, and her eyes grew wide in alarm. "What about the Indians? If you were in the woods all alone, an Indian might get you with his tomahawk." Silence fell in the cabin. Even Luther cocked his head to the side and whimpered. Barbara had heard the rumors. Unrest was growing between the French and the English over their western borders. Some said many Indian nations would ally with the French. Regina, my, what ideas your little head has come up with." John tousled his sister's hair affectionately. "You know the Indians are our friends. They sold us this land. Besides, there has not been an Indian raid in Pennsylvania since the colony first saw settlers over 70 years ago." Despite John's reassuring words, Barbara noticed Mother glancing at Father's with a concerned look. He paused, thinking deeply before he spoke. "Regina, do you remember why your mother and I decided to come to this land?" "Yes, sir," Regina said, smiling. "Because here we are slave to no man, and we are free to live as God sees." "That is right, my little one," Father said, and then took Mother's hand in his. When your mother and I decided to leave Germany to come to this land, we knew there would be dangers and hardships, but we also knew it was the price we must pay for freedom. Even if the Indians were to attack and take our lives, we would still be free. What could be more wonderful than to go from our beautiful valley straight to heaven? Christian, who had been deep in thought over the whole matter, added gravely, Papa's right, Regina. I remember what it was like to till the Count's land in Germany. We broke our backs working the fields, only to nearly starve during the long winters. He took a deep breath. I would give my life any day to be here as a free man. Even though I cannot imagine it, heaven will be more glorious than this. Ava, shh. Sorry, my dogs. Regina, I think it is time for you to help your sister with the dishes, said Mother. Regina, who was never worried about anything for more than a moment, jumped up from her seat and skipped over next to Barbara, at the wash basin. As Barbara dried the last of the dishes, she could hear her father making plans for the following morning. Even though he sounded perfectly at peace, he was still taking extra precautions. John, Father said, your mother is going to mill tomorrow to grind the harvest corn into meal. And as you know, it is a good day's journey. Looking squarely into John's face, conveying through his eyes more than he spoke, Father continued, I will need Christian's help in the fields, and I want you to go with your mother to the mill. Father turned to Barbara just as he dried the last dish. Though he tried to hide his concerns, Barbara saw a forced smile. Come, my golden-haired princess, let us read the scriptures. Barbara blushed with delight, and at the compliment of being called her father's princess, rushing to the old German trunk, which had traveled with them all the way across the ocean, she opened it and carefully lifted out the large Bible. Father waited until the ladies had situated themselves about the table before opening the black cover with its beautiful gold lettering shining by the firelight. Then, in his deep and caring voice, he began to read the words that melted away all the fears and cares of the day. Barbara listened carefully to every word. She could tell Regina, who sat next to her, was trying her best to sit still, but her eyes darted about the room. Her hands toyed with the tucks in her dress, and her foot kicked Barbara's leg in rhythm, as if she were keeping time with the dog's wagging tail. It was evident that her mind had drifted far away into one of the lands where her vivid imagination often traveled. Barbara nudged her little sister. Regina jumped into alarm and glanced at his father with repentant yet playful eyes and joined them in reciting their daily memory passage, Deuteronomy 8:2. And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. Father again looked lovingly around the snug room and whispered thanks to his heavenly Father for the blessings that had been bestowed on them. After a few thought-filled moments, he looked at Barbara and asked, do you know what Scripture means when it talks about the Lord's taking his people through the wilderness? Yes, Father. Barbara was pleased to know the answer. It's talking about the children of Israel after they left Egypt. That's right, my little princess. Father smiled approvingly. But did you know that God led me through a similar wilderness? Everyone eagerly turned toward Father. They loved to hear him speak of the past, for he could tell stories better than anyone else. Yes, it too was a test of about 40 years. It was to see if my heart would remain faithful to the Lord. You see, when I was a young man in Germany, about your age, John, I heard of a faraway promised land with fertile soil and rich in wild game. Unlike the Count's crowded valley, which my family had farmed for generations, a man could live on his own, make a living, and even have an inheritance to pass on to his children. Father stared into the dying embers in the hearth with a faraway look in his eyes. Naturally, I wanted to pack up and leave Germany right away, but God had other plans. No, before I could leave Germany, I needed to walk through some trials and tests. God knew the lesson I needed to learn before my faith was ready for this promised land. Father chuckled and shook his head. His hand ran over the dry, brittle leather of his harness he had been repairing. At times, the challenges were so difficult that I thought I would never make it. But now that I'm here in this wonderful place God promised, I can see it was the trials that prepared me for the blessings God had for us in this new country. He looked gravely at his children, and then with tender earnestness, he went on. Each of you will have times of testing in your life, but you must always remember, no matter how difficult the trial or how dense the wilderness, God will never leave you. If your hearts remain true, God promises endless blessings. His words stirred Barbara's heart. The silence that followed was only interrupted by an occasional snap from the slowly vanishing embers. Mother began softly mumbling the tune of an old German hymn. Soon the whole family joined in, and they sang the comforting and rich words to Alone Yet Not Alone. Regina's voice carried above all others. She loved singing. Mother always called her their little songbird. But all of the hymns, this was her favorite. Barbara smiled at her little sister, and she sang verse after verse. Alone, yet not alone am I. This is, though in this solitude so drear, I felt my Savior always nigh. He comes the weary hours to cheer. I am with him, and he with me. I, therefore, cannot lonely be. Father asked Christian to close with prayer, and then Mother suggested it was time for Barbara and Regina to be off to bed. Barbara let down the curtain that separated their sleeping area from the rest of the cabin and quickly changed into her long woolen nightgown. The room was cold away from the hearth, so she could not wait to jump into bed with Regina. She was glad to share a bed, especially on cold nights. When they were ready, Mother pulled back the curtain and sat on the edge of their straw-tipped mattress. She pulled the covers up around Barbara's chin and bestowed a tender kiss on her forehead. Barbara yawned. Oh, please, Mother, whispered Regina with a childlike affection. Will you sing my song once more? Ah, but you must get to sleep, my little one. I already see your eyelids are heavy. How will you grow tall and strong like Barbara if you never let them rest? Yes, Mother. But I always dream sweetly when I fall asleep listening to the sound of your voice. Mother laughed and then placed a kiss on Regina's forehead. Her melodious voice filled the cabin with its soothing tones. Barbara watched as the last glow of the firelight flickered across her mother's pretty face. Her expression was so full of love and joy that Barbara's heart filled with an unexplainable peace. The dangers that lay in the forest beyond now seemed far away. Slowly, she drifted into sleep. Outside, the tall figure who just hours before had stood still as a statue watching the family had long since sneaked back into the slumbering forest just as quietly as he had come. He now sat in the front of his own campfire, his eyes burning as bright as the light that flickered before him. His face did not soften in the gleam, but instead the dancing reflection highlighted his hardened features and accentuated the furrows in his brow. Soon his companions joined him, engaging in deep and agitated conversation, until at last all was settled and they too fell asleep. Only their dreams were of a different sort than Barbara's. They were not of peace and tranquility. Chapter 2. Barbara awoke and dressed hurriedly as the earliest shades of morning stole across the eastern horizon. Darkness still surrounded their cabin, and the morning star hung steadfastly in the sky, twinkling as if happy to be the only star still shining from the heavens. She shook Regina, who was still snuggled deeply under the warm patchwork quilt Mother had brought from Germany. It was a treasured wedding gift. "Hurry, Mother, and John are leaving." Regina rubbed her eyes and stretched. With a start, she sat straight up in bed. "Mother's leaving?" "Yes, for the mill, remember?" Barbara laughed at her drowsy sister. Regina bounded out of bed. Their mother and John, already prepared for their day's journey, quietly bid the family goodbye, as if they didn't want to break the tranquility of the morning. Regina, however, made up for the quiet. "Goodbye, dear Mother," she said, throwing her arms around her neck. Barbara wondered if she ever intended to let go. Finally, Regina bounded toward John and bid him a similar farewell. Mother looked down at Barbara and brushed a strand of hair out of her eyes. "Take good care of Father and Christian while I'm gone. I've left some salt pork in the cupboard for stew." Mother smiled and hugged her daughter affectionately. "And if you can see to it that Regina practices the spelling and arithmetic lessons on her slate while your father is in the field." "I'll take good care of her, Mother." Barbara was delighted that her mother treated her as if she were a grown-up. Having already bid them farewell, Father and Christian were headed for the barn to see the livestock, while Mother and John climbed into the wagon. Barbara held Regina's hand as the wagon, followed by Luther, who was merrily wagging his tail, headed down the trail. They watched until it blended in with the dim light of the morning. Regina shivered and huddled closer to Barbara. With Mother gone, Barbara now took her place. "Has the chill of the morning air nipped you?" Barbara asked, putting her arm around her little sister. "Don't worry, our morning chores shall drive it away." "It's not that I'm cold," answered Regina, more to herself than Barbara. "It was just thinking how I do not like goodbyes." She gripped Barbara's hand slightly. "How awful it would be if I never saw Mother again." "Regina, there goes your imagination again. Don't be silly. Besides, it's dreadful to dwell on such things. Mother and John will be home by lunch tomorrow." But Barbara shifted uneasily. She had already had the same thought as she watched the wagon disappear into the woods. "Come," said Barbara. "Christian had promised to take us to the Leroy's cabin after lunch if we complete all of our chores this morning." The Leroys were a Swiss family that lived halfway across the valley. They were the Leiningers' nearest neighbors and shared the same faith and convictions. It was not uncommon for two families to help each other's workloads, especially during the harvest season. The girls looked forward to these visits because the Leroy's only daughter, Marie, was about Barbara's age. Delighted at the thought of visiting their neighbors, Regina was soon happily singing as she smoothed the bed quilts on the floor. "He comes the weary hours to cheer. I am with him, and he with me. I therefore cannot lonely be." Barbara looked up from the corn as she was shucking and watched Regina sing and dance around the corn husk broom. "The hearth will never be clean at this rate," Barbara tried to hide the growing smile that threatened to encourage her sister's daydreaming behavior. "Do hurry, Regina. It's almost time to start preparing lunch, and we still need to shuck and scrape all the corn we gathered yesterday." I can't wait to braid the dried husk into a rug, cried Regina. When do we start? Not until the harvest is in and winter keeps us indoors. Then we can braid rugs, make new brooms, and even make corn husk dolls. Barbara unhooked the large iron kettle from the hearth and stoked the fire. It was time to start making the stew. Barbara nearly flew from the cupboard to the table, to the hearth, and back to the table. Regina helped to chop some fresh carrots and potatoes she had gathered from the garden, but they knew it. Their father and Christian had returned from the field, eager for the lunch the girls had carefully prepared. It wasn't often that their mother left Barbara in charge of the house, and she was determined to fix the finest meal possible for the men. As it turned out, the stew tasted a little scorched, and the rolls were not as light as Mother's, but both went unnoticed. The girls glowed with the praise they received from their father. Girls, your brother and I could not be more pleased with the lunch you have prepared, he said with a sideways glance and a wink at Christian. A man could never survive in this wilderness if... Suddenly the cabin door swung open and in walked two Indians. Christian and Father jumped to their feet and stood face to face with the grim-faced warriors. Barbara blinked in disbelief. She had seen Indians before, but never had they stormed into the cabin with such manner. Their dress was unfamiliar. They were mostly bald, except for a few eagle feathers attached to a tuft of hair in the center of their heads. Their faces were painted with stripes, hardening their sharp features and accentuating their sullen eyes. There were several leather straps across their strong painted chest, and various weapons dangled from their straps. Barbara noted that their powder horns looked very much like Christians, but other than that, the implements were unfamiliar. Looking at Father, Barbara immediately sensed his alarm. She watched in amazement as he quickly regained his composure. Please sit, have some stew, Father gestured toward the table. At first, Barbara wondered why he had so quickly forgotten their startling behavior. But then she remembered John had said the Indians near their valley had always lived in peace. She reasoned that her father was just trying to assure the braves of his friendship. Again, her father mentioned for them to take a seat, but the warriors stood silently surveying the room. The younger of the two stared at Barbara, blonde hair, as if he had never seen the like. Barbara shifted uneasily and put her arm around Regina, who had inched closer to her big sister. After what felt like hours, the older brave pointed at Barbara and said, "Squaw, give whiskey." The gaze from his cold eyes penetrated to her bones. Father quickly answered for his daughter in a controlled yet firm voice. "We have no whiskey. Surely our Indian brother would like to smoke some tobacco instead." Knowing the Indians' love for tobacco, the Leningers had stored away a stash for occasions like this. The Indians grunted in reply. Barbara, thankful for an excuse to get away from their expressionless faces and peering eyes, quickly motioned for Regina to follow her as she crossed the room to get the tobacco out of the trunk. Following the example of her father's boldness, she promptly returned to offer the Indians the tobacco. The warriors seemed satisfied and sat by the hearth, quietly smoking a full pipe of tobacco. Father and Christian returned to the table and continued to eat their lunch, pretending not to be bothered by the odd actions of their guests. Regina and Barbara retreated to the far end of the cabin and sat on the edge of their bed, finding comfort in distancing themselves from the painted warriors. Regina sat close to her sister and stared blankly at the stripes on Barbara's apron. Barbara studied the Indians more closely. The younger brave was definitely taller than the stronger, but his eyes were not as fierce. He looked to be about John's age. The other Indian was much older, by at least 15 years. He also had a long hooked nose. His gruff mannerism made Barbara more frightened of him. The older warrior carried a musket. A tomahawk hung from his belt. She noticed a peculiar object hanging next to it. Her heart surged with a sudden horror as she realized what she was seeing. It appeared very much like she imagined a scalp would look. Barbara quickly closed her eyes, trying to wash away the thought. Her father must have noticed the same thing, because he calmly, yet urgently, spoke to the girls in German language the Indians could not understand. "Girls, go now to the creek and fetch some water. But you must not return until after the Indians have gone." The girls started toward the door, and he turned to the Indians and spoke English. "You must be thirsty from your travels. The girls will go and get some water." Barbara quickly took Regina's hand and grabbed the water pail. As the girls crossed the threshold, Barbara looked back. The Indian with the long hooked nose abruptly stood and with fiery eyes declared in broken English, "We Allegheny Indians, friend of French." He narrowed his gaze. "Brothers no longer." That was the last Barbara heard as she rushed out of the door. She did not fully understand, but she knew something was dreadfully wrong. Once outside, Barbara wanted to run to the creek and distance herself from the unwelcome visitors. But for Regina's sake, she made herself be strong. "I don't like those Indians," Regina whispered. "Why do they carry so many weapons?" "Maybe they've been hunting," Barbara suggested as they reached the creek bank. "I'm sure they will leave soon." Barbara felt far more secure under the sheltering branches of the birch trees that grew along the water's edge. Holding up their skirts, they waded knee-deep into the cool current so they could dip the bucket in the fresh water. Unfortunately, the feeling of safety did not last long. Within moments, Barbara heard a terrifying whoop coming from the direction of the cabin, followed by a gunshot and an eerie silence. "Barbara," Regina whispered. What was that?" Barbara looked down at her little sister. All the color had drained from Regina's rosy cheeks, and she was trembling like a maple leaf shimmering in the autumn winds. Taking Regina's hand, Barbara attempted to calm her fright, but she found that her own hand shook just as much. Fastening her gaze into the shadows beyond the opening cabin door, Barbara anxiously waited for her father to appear. There was nothing, no one, just silence. Without thinking, she left her wool skirt drop into the cold, rushing waters. Then the noise began. There was loud crashing and banging, as if things were being tossed around the cabin. Wood splintered as if the dinner table was knocking over, and the chairs were broken into pieces. Barbara realized the Indians were plundering their cabin. Straining, she heard material ripping. Her eyes widened as bits of straw and corn husks flew out the door. They had ripped open the bedding. Barbara could hear sparks snap and crackle as the hearth fire grew stronger. What were they burning? It wasn't until black smoke began to billow out of the chimney and drift out through the doorway that Barbara saw the two Indians run into the yard. She instinctively urged Regina to hide among the tall grass. Soon, dense smoke poured out of the door opening, causing Barbara to fear for her father's and brother's lives. Why didn't they come out? She tried to see into the darkened cabin. It was then that she noticed the Indians were carefully surveying the yard, the barn, and the cornfield beyond, and then the creek bank. They were looking for them. She wanted to call for Father and Christian to come rescue them, but she knew they had to be quiet. Her heart ached to catch a reassuring glimpse of father. The Indians' penetrating gazes swept over Barbara and Regina's hiding place. Barbara put her arm around Regina, slowly pressing her deeper into the moist, grassy bank. She held her breath and hoped they would pass over them, but the Indians' skilled eyes quickly picked them out from forms from the grasses. A few quick strides, and the strong brave stood towering above the trembling girls. Barbara tried to scramble out of the reach, but the younger warrior grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet. Twisting, Barbara turned toward the brave and kicked him with all her strength she could gather. He stood unmoved and appeared almost amused by her struggle. Looking defiantly at the brave, she tried to yank her arm free. "Where is your father?" she yelled. "Where is father?" she yelled. "I must get back to the cabin." The older brave secured Regina under his arm and bolted for the shelter of the nearby forest. Stretching her arms back toward the burning cabin, Regina cried out in sheer panic, "Papa, Papa, come get me, Papa." Tears streamed down Regina's face as she watched her home disappear behind the dense trees. "Regina!" Barbara cried, as she saw her sister being carried into the woods. Barbara had to stop him. She had to save her sister. "Regina!" she cried again. Ceasing her struggle, she let herself be dragged away toward her sister. The young brave had already tightened his grip on her arm. With quick strides, he also headed for the forest. As Barbara stumbled along behind him, she caught a glimpse of Regina's pale face and glints of the fierce warrior's tomahawk. Barbara struggled to keep up with her young captor's fast pace. She was determined not to let Regina out of her sight. I hope you enjoyed chapters 1 and 2 of Alone, Yet Not Alone, The Faith of Their Freedom. I will post another video of chapters 3 and 4. Please like this video and share it because this is brand new. I don't know how to end this. See ya!